Imagine, if you will, like watching a monumental, totally unprecedented political experiment just unfold right before your eyes.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you've dedicated your entire life, your writings, your organizing, basically your very existence to bringing about this exact moment, right?
Right.
You see the working people of one of the world's greatest cities actually seize power. I mean, they build barricades, they hold off the national army, and for a brief shining window, they actually govern themselves.
It's an incredible image.
It is. And then, and this is the heartbreaking part, you have to watch it get absolutely crushed, violently, mercilessly, within just a matter of months.
Yeah.
And if navigating that heartbreak isn't enough, you are then immediately faced with this daunting, almost impossible task of figuring out how to rebuild an entire global movement from literal smoking ashes of that defeat.
It's a terrifying position to be in.
It really is. And that intense, high-stakes scenario is exactly what's facing the subjects of our deep dive today.
Because it's arguably one of the most profound historical pivot points in modern political history. You know?
Oh, absolutely.
We're looking at a moment where the survival of a movement wasn't just about, like, rallying morale or writing a fiery pamphlet. It was about totally rethinking the architectural mechanics of how a global idea actually operates when it collides with the brutal reality of state power.
Right. Which brings us to the core of what we are doing today. So welcome, if you're listening, to a deep dive where we are pulling apart the historical source material. Specifically, we're looking at Volume 23 of the Marx and Engels collected works to figure out how this movement actually survived.
Yeah, Volume 23, it's a heavy one.
It is. And this volume covers a remarkably turbulent window, specifically 1871 to 1874. But we aren't just looking at the polished, published theoretical essays, right?
No, not at all.
We are pulling in the context from their personal letters, their internal memos, their frantic organizational dispatches from this exact same period, because we really want to understand the gritty, behind-the-scenes reality of what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
And frankly, what they were dealing with was chaos.
Total chaos.
Yeah, these sources capture a massive organizational pivot. So today, we're going to look at how they reacted to the catastrophic fall of the 1871 Paris Commune, how they attempted to manage the fierce, like almost violently fracturing internal dynamics within their own global network.
Which were getting really out of hand.
Oh, completely. And finally, why they ultimately came to this radical counterintuitive decision to intentionally let their own international organization die just so that localized national parties could have a chance to thrive.
Right. Now, before we really get into the weeds here, we do need to set a quick ground rule for this deep dive. And it's a crucial one for you listening.
Very crucial.
The historical sources we are exploring today, they contain highly charged political theories. We're talking fierce debates about capitalism, anarchism, the abolition of the state, the role of the bourgeoisie, the logistics of revolutionary strategy, all of it.
It's intense material.
It is. So our goal today is not to endorse or debate the morality of or take a side on any of these viewpoints.
Right. We're not taking sides.
Exactly. We are here to impartially analyze these texts as historical artifacts. We just want to understand the ideas exactly as they are presented in the source material, to, see the machinery of their arguments and understand how they diagnose the world around them without adopting their conclusions as our own.
And that objective distance is really the only way to understand the text, honestly.
Right, right.
Like, by examining their writing analytically, we can actually understand the mechanics of 19th century political organization. We get to see the evolution of a framework that would, quite literally, go on to shape a massive portion of global history.
Yeah, you can't ignore the impact.
Exactly. If we just dismiss them or cheerlead for them, we miss the underlying logic of why they made the very specific strategic choices they did.
So true. So to understand the logic behind everything Marx and Engels are writing between 1871 and 1874, we first have to understand the massive, overwhelming ghost that is haunting Europe at this time.
The biggest ghost.
Yeah. Every letter, every memo in this volume is steeped in the aftermath of one single event, which is the Paris Commune.
You really just cannot overstate the shadow the Commune casts over everything they did next.
Tell us about that. Like, what was the actual situation?
Well, in March of 1871, following the just total devastation of the Franco-Prussian War, a proletarian revolution actually took place in Paris.
The workers just took over.
They did. The regular French government basically fled to Versailles, and the workers literally took control of the city. And for a brief 72-day window, It was the first working-class government in history.
Which is wild to think about. And it wasn't just like a continuous street riot for 72 days. I mean, they actually governed, right? They implemented real policy.
They absolutely did. And the source material shows Marx and Engels feverishly studying what the communards were doing.
What kind of stuff are they looking at?
Well, for example, they capped the salaries of public officials so they didn't earn more than an average worker's wage.
Wow, so no rich politicians.
Exactly. They completely separated church and state. They even implemented highly specific labor protections. Like one of the famous ones is banning night work for bakers, which was this notoriously grueling, health-destroying shift.
Oh, that's so specific, but it makes sense if workers are the ones writing the laws.
Right. They were trying to invent a completely new kind of society in real time, all while completely surrounded by a hostile national army.
But as we mentioned in the hook, it didn't last.
No.
The French National Army breached the city in late May, and the suppression was it was horrific.
Truly brutal.
The event became known as the Bloody Week, or Semaine Sanglante. And the texts mention Marx writing this piece called Notes on the Condition of the Refugees from the Commune, because suddenly London, where he and Engels were living, was just flooded with people fleeing for their lives.
Yeah, they're dealing directly with the human fallout.
The tragedy, the trauma of it all. But reading through Volume 23, I was really struck by how they processed this. Because they didn't just throw their hands up and say, well, that was a disaster, let's pack it in.
Not at all.
No. The source material quotes them calling the Paris Commune a, quote, new point of departure of world historic importance.
Yes.
Which, okay, how does a massacre become a point of departure?
That's a great question. And it's because it provided the one thing they desperately lacked prior to 1871, which was empirical data.
Like real-world proof.
Exactly. Before the Commune, a lot of their writing about the transition of power, specifically this concept they use a lot, the dictatorship of the proletariat, it was largely theoretical.
Okay, let's actually pause right there and define that term. Because if you're listening to this today, dictatorship of the proletariat sounds incredibly authoritarian to a modern ear.
Oh, it definitely does. But in the political vocabulary of the 19th century, dictatorship was often understood more in the ancient Roman sense,
Like an emergency power.
Yeah, a temporary emergency concentration of power to handle a specific crisis. Because for Marx and Engels, all states were fundamentally a dictatorship of one class over another.
Right.
So a capitalist state, in their view, is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the owning class.
Okay.
The dictatorship of the proletariat simply meant the working class taking temporary, total control of the state apparatus to dismantle the power of the old ruling class and, most importantly, prevent them from violently retaking control.
So it's defensive, in a way.
In their framework, yes. But until Paris, they didn't know what that actually looked like in practice.
So the Commune was essentially their real-world laboratory. It moved their theories from, these abstract concepts to a gritty, practical analysis of how a state actually functions.
Exactly. The Commune forced them to analyze the specific mechanical conditions required to hold political power.
Give me an example from the text.
Well, the texts show them studying the fact that the communards didn't just take over the existing French state machinery, they smashed it and built something entirely new.
They didn't just inherit the old government offices.
Right. For instance, they abolished the standing army.
Wow.
Why? Because they argued that a standing army, isolated from the people, is the ultimate tool of state oppression. The Commune replaced it with the armed populace.
Just the citizens themselves?
Yeah. And they made all elected officials instantly recallable by the voters. So while the defeat in May was a devastating tactical loss for Marx and Engels, it was actually a massive theoretical victory.
Because it proved something.
It gave them the blueprint. It gave them what they needed to refine their framework for the next attempt.
But with that tactical loss came a huge, undeniable geographic shift. Because with the French movement essentially wiped out, its most capable leaders were either executed against the walls of the Père Lachaise cemetery, or they were imprisoned in penal colonies, or living in exile, like we talked about in London.
Yeah, the French movement was decapitated.
So the center of gravity for the European working class movement, according to the texts, shifted to Germany.
Yes, the sources specifically highlight the German Social Democratic Workers' Party.
Which had been around for a bit, right?
Since 1869, yeah.
Yeah.
Operating under the leadership of figures like August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht. And in the aftermath of Paris, Marx and Engels really began to view this German party as the, quote, vanguard contingent of the international movement.
Now, looking at this objectively, I have to ask you, Was this just a default choice?
How do you mean?
Well, it feels a little bit like a multinational company shifting its headquarters after a sudden market crash in its primary region. Like, well, the Paris office burned down, our French management team is gone, so I guess we are operating out of Berlin now out of sheer geographical convenience.
Ah, I see.
Did they place so much faith in Germany just because they were the only ones left standing?
It's a completely logical question. But if we look closely at the correspondence from this period, it wasn't a default fallback at all.
It wasn't.
No, it was a highly deliberate choice based on a very specific performance under extreme pressure. The source material points to the German workers, and this is a, quote, genuinely international attitude during the war.
Okay, and by war, you're referring to the Franco-Prussian War, which immediately preceded the Commune.
Yes, the war between Bismarck's Prussia and Napoleon III's France. Because historically, when a war breaks out, the working classes of the warring nations tend to get swept up in a wave of nationalism.
Right, everybody rallies around the flag.
They join the army, they sing the anthem, and all that international worker solidarity just vanishes overnight.
Well, because it's incredibly dangerous not to. I mean,
Yeah.
if your country is at war and you are out there organizing strikes or telling workers not to fight the enemy, you aren't just a political nuisance anymore. You are committing treason.
Precisely. The stakes are literally lethal.
Yeah.
But the German party leaders, Bebel and Liebknecht, had actually stood up in the North German parliament and abstained from voting for war credits.
Wow.
And later, they actively took immense political risks to oppose Germany's annexation of the French territories of Alsace and Lorraine.
So they are publicly going against the war effort.
They publicly declared solidarity with the French workers while their own country was at war with France.
So they really survived the ultimate stress test. They didn't just write nice articles about international solidarity during peacetime. They maintained it when the state was actively demanding they fall in line and be good nationalists.
And they went to prison for it.
Did they really?
Yes. Bebel and Liebknecht were convicted of treason. So for Marx and Engels, observing this from London, this proved that the German movement had a profound ideological soundness.
They practiced what they preached.
Exactly. They had internalized the theory deeply enough to withstand the intoxicating pull of wartime nationalism. And that is what made them the ideal, battle-tested anchor for the movement going forward. It wasn't just the fact that the French were out of the picture.
That is fascinating. So the ideological center of the movement is shifting east to Germany. But while that is happening, the actual organizational body they used to unite all these workers across borders, the International Working Men's Association, which we usually just call the First International, is starting to crack under immense internal pressure.
Yeah, the First International. It was founded in 1864. It was always a very broad church,
Like a big tent.
Right. It wasn't a monolith at all. It brought together British trade unionists, French mutualists, German socialists, and Russian anarchists.
That is a volatile mix.
It was a very fragile coalition. And Volume 23 gives us a front row seat to how the trauma of the Commune basically turned those internal fractures into massive chasms.
Well, let's start with the baseline, right? The rule book that was theoretically supposed to be holding all these factions together. We have Marx's general rules and administrative regulations of the International.
Yes.
And the core thesis quoted in the text is incredibly famous. It says, the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves. And it continues that this is a struggle for equal rights and duties and the abolition of all class rule.
And that first phrase, conquered by the working classes themselves, that is the absolute bedrock of their entire project.
Why is that so central?
Because it's a total rejection of the idea that some enlightened group of upper-class philanthropists or a benevolent king or even a small group of secret conspirators is just going to swoop in and hand freedom to the workers.
Like a savior complex.
Exactly.
Right.
The workers have to develop the consciousness and the organization to take it themselves. But the problem, as the sources document in just agonizing detail, is that within this broad Church of the International, there were fundamentally opposing views on how that emancipation should be achieved and what it should even look like.
And reading these texts, it sounds like an absolute nightmare to manage.
Oh, a total headache.
Yeah. Like a large chunk of Volume 23 reads like what we might call housekeeping documents.
Mhm.
But the housekeeping involves putting out massive, potentially fatal fires.
Right.
Like, we see the expulsion of Gustav Durand, we see a public declaration against a guy named Nechayev for literally misusing the International's name. And they publish this massive pamphlet titled Fictitious Splits in the International.
Which is just a great title.
It is. But it honestly reminds me, looking at it today, of a massive early open source software project that is just suddenly buckling under its own weight.
Oh, that's interesting. How do you mean, what's the parallel there?
Well, imagine you create this revolutionary new open source code, right? That's the International.
Yep.
The goal is to build a new operating system for society. So you invite developers from all over Europe to contribute to the code base, to take it back to their local servers and build on it.
Right, democratizing it.
Exactly. But suddenly, because the project is getting so much attention and power, it's being hijacked by bad actors and splinter factions.
So they found a vulnerability in the open source structure.
Exactly. You've got people introducing malicious code, like this Gustav Durand guy. The texts reveal he actually turned out to be a French police spy trying to infiltrate the network.
Literally a virus.
Right. Then you have rogue developers like Sergei Nechayev. Nechayev was a Russian radical, and he was known for these extreme nihilistic tactics. He believed in assassination and totally ruthless deception.
Yeah, he was intense.
And the texts show him claiming his secret society was backed by the International. So he's essentially using their brand name to launch his own aggressive, completely unapproved software fork.
That is a great way to put it.
And instead of writing new code, instead of developing the economic theory and organizing the actual workers, the founders, Marx and Engels, on the General Council, are forced to spend all their time playing whack-a-mole.
Yes.
They're frantically moderating the forums, writing patches, and trying to kick out bad actors before the whole system crashes.
That is a remarkably apt analogy for the reality documented in Volume 23. They were constantly debugging the organization while it was running live.
Exactly.
But here's the thing. The spies and the nihilists, they were actually the lesser threats.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The most significant existential rogue developers they were fighting to contain were two massive rival factions, the Bakuninists and the Lassalleans.
Okay, let's break those two down, because the battle against them takes up a huge amount of oxygen in these texts. Let's start with the Bakuninists. Who were they, and what was their fundamental disagreement with the General Council?
So the Bakuninists were the followers of Mikhail Bakunin. He was a very charismatic Russian revolutionary who basically represented the anarchist wing of the movement. They operated a group called the Alliance of Socialist Democracy. And according to the texts, Marx and Engels accused them of trying to secretly subvert the International from within.
But what was their core philosophy? Like, if Marx wants the working class to seize the state, what does Bakunin want?
Bakunin wanted the immediate, total abolition of the state and all forms of centralized authority. Instantly. For the anarchists, any state, even a dictatorship of the proletariat, was inherently oppressive. So they completely rejected the need for participating in traditional politics, like running for parliament.
Wow, okay.
And they fundamentally rejected the idea of a centralized, disciplined working-class party directing the revolution. They just believed in spontaneous, localized uprisings.
So if we go back to the open source analogy, Marx is saying we need a core development team, the General Council, to make sure all the local branches are using compatible code and moving in the same direction.
Right.
And Bakunin is saying any core team is just a new set of tech overlords. We need a purely peer-to-peer network with zero central authority, and every local node can just spontaneously do whatever it wants.
That is exactly the theoretical divide. And Marx and Engels viewed this anarchist approach not just as naive, but as incredibly dangerous.
Why dangerous?
Because they argued that while a peer-to-peer network sounds very liberating, you are still fighting a highly centralized, well-funded capitalist state with a unified military. If you refuse to centralize your own forces, you will just be crushed.
You're playing devil's advocate here for a moment, because we do want to remain impartial to the texts.
Sure.
When you read Bakunin's arguments against Marx, he warns that if you build a centralized socialist state, it will just become a new ruling class, right?
Yes, a bureaucracy.
Exactly, a bureaucracy that oppresses the workers in the name of the workers. And looking at the history of the 20th century, a lot of people would argue Bakunin's warning about centralized authority was incredibly prescient. Isn't Bakunin right to fear this centralizing instinct?
It's a profound historical debate. And the texts actually show Marx and Engels engaging with exactly that critique.
How do they respond?
Their counter-argument, which we see formulated across these documents, is essentially a question of survival logistics. They acknowledge the dangers of authority, but they argue that revolution is, by definition, the most authoritarian act imaginable.
What do you mean?
Well, it is one part of the population imposing its will on the other with rifles and cannons.
Oh, right. Very literal authority.
Exactly. So if you dismantle your organizational authority before you have completely defeated the entrenched power of the bourgeoisie, the old ruling class will simply use their centralized military to crush your spontaneous, decentralized communes one by one.
Which is exactly what happened to the Paris Commune.
Exactly. For Marx and Engels, the question wasn't whether authority was pleasant. It was whether it was tactically necessary to actually win the war.
That makes a lot of sense from a strategic standpoint.
And then on the complete opposite side of this debate, attacking them from the other flank, were the Lassalleans in Germany.
Right, the followers of Ferdinand Lassalle. The texts note that they were heavily criticized for slanderously misrepresenting the campaign against the Bakuninists. But what was their actual political program? If Bakunin wanted no state, what did Lassalle want?
The Lassalleans were much more reformist. They believed that the working class could achieve its goals by negotiating with the existing Prussian state, which at the time was a conservative, aristocratic monarchy led by Bismarck.
Negotiate with Bismarck? Really?
Yeah. The Lassalleans focused on demanding state-sponsored workers' cooperatives and universal suffrage, basically believing the existing state could just be pressured into becoming a tool for socialist change.
So they didn't want to smash the state like Marx, and they didn't want to spontaneously abolish it like Bakunin. They just wanted to elect new management.
Precisely. And Marx and Engels viewed this as a dangerous utopian compromise.
Why utopia?
Because they argued that the Prussian state was structurally designed to protect the ruling class. You couldn't just vote your way into socialism within a system built to suppress it. The state would just co-opt your leaders and completely defang your movement.
So you have this incredible three-way tug of war happening.
Yeah.
You have anarchists on one side wanting to smash all authority and decentralize immediately. You have Lassalleans on the other side wanting to negotiate and integrate with the existing aristocratic state.
Right.
And Marx and Engels are caught in the middle, trying to steer this massive ship, while half the crew is trying to dismantle the steering wheel, and the other half is trying to surrender to the enemy navy.
That is exactly what it was like. And what makes Volume 23 so compelling is that this wasn't just like theoretical bickering in a London pub.
Right. Real lives are at stake.
Exactly. While dealing with this incredible organizational headache, Marx and Engels were actively trying to apply their theories to unfolding real-world events. They needed to prove to the workers of Europe that their specific methodology worked and that the rival methodologies, specifically anarchism, failed when tested in reality.
Which brings us to a massive case study in the text. Spain.
Oh yes, Spain.
Because Volume 23 contains a piece written by Engels in 1873 titled The Bakuninists at Work, an account of the Spanish Revolt. In reading this, he goes absolutely hard against the anarchists. He is not mincing words.
He is writing a brutal, almost forensic autopsy of a failed revolution.
What happened?
Well, in the summer of 1873, Spain declared itself a republic. That led to a huge political crisis and a localized uprising known as the Cantonalist Revolt.
Okay.
The Bakuninists, the anarchists, had a very significant presence in the Spanish working class movement, so this was essentially their moment to shine. And Engels uses this event as a live, real-time case study to critique anarchist theory.
So we defined the theory earlier, right? The idea of spontaneous, localized rebellion without any centralized authority. How does Engels say that theory held up when the bullets actually started flying in Spain?
According to Engels' account in the text, it was a catastrophic failure of logistics and military reality.
In what way?
Well, a canton is essentially a small, highly localized, autonomous regional government. Because the anarchists believed in absolute local autonomy and rejected any central political command, they refused to form a unified national or even regional army.
Okay, so they just stayed in their own towns.
Right. They took control of various cities, but they didn't link them together.
So if I'm understanding the military mechanics of this, and please correct me if I'm misreading the text, Engels is arguing that because City A refused to take orders from a central command, they just didn't send reinforcements when City B was attacked.
That is exactly the dynamic Engels describes. Because they prioritized local autonomy over centralized coordination, they basically allowed the Spanish government troops to just march across the country, defeating the revolution city by city, canton by canton.
Wow.
The government forces were often outnumbered overall, but because the government had a unified command structure, they could concentrate all their forces on one isolated anarchist city at a time.
So he's essentially saying to the workers of Europe, look, we tried the anarchist, open source, no moderator, purely peer-to-peer approach, and the servers literally crashed the second a coordinated attack hit them.
That's precisely his argument. For Engels, Spain was the tragic, practical proof that rejecting political organization and centralized authority doesn't lead to instant freedom.
It just makes you weak.
It just makes you easy, isolated prey for the organized military of the capitalist state.
Okay, so that is how they analyze the failure of anarchism in Spain. But the source material also points to massive, frustrating problems in England.
Yeah.
And we are pulling heavily from their personal letters here, which is fantastic because we get their raw, unfiltered, incredibly frustrated reactions to what's happening.
They're very frustrated.
They really are. They were deeply concerned about the English working class falling into what they called reformism. Now, on paper, this shouldn't be happening, right?
Right. By Marx and Engels' own earlier logic, England should have been the epicenter of the global proletarian revolution.
Why England specifically?
It was the most advanced capitalist country in the world at the time. It was the absolute heart of the Industrial Revolution, with massive factories and a massive, highly concentrated working class. The objective conditions for a socialist revolution were theoretically perfect.
But the revolution wasn't happening in London.
No.
So why not? How did they explain this massive hole in their theory?
This is where their analysis gets incredibly sophisticated. The texts detail a concept they formulated called the labor aristocracy.
The labor aristocracy, okay.
It's a fascinating sociological observation that explains how capitalism can adapt to preserve itself. They argue that because England dominated the world market and had this vast global empire, the British bourgeoisie had amassed staggering, unprecedented wealth, super profits.
And they didn't just hoard all of it. They actually used a fraction of that imperial wealth to essentially buy off a very specific, influential section of their own domestic working class.
Yes, exactly. They offered higher wages, better conditions, and legal recognition to the skilled trades. You know, the mechanics, the engineers, the established union leaders.
So they created a hierarchy.
They created a privileged upper layer within the working class itself.
You know, if you're listening to this and wondering why a little extra money would stop a revolution, think about the modern economy. Specifically, think about something like the tech sector versus the gig economy.
Oh, that's a good parallel.
Right. If you have a massive corporation and you give a small, highly skilled subset of your workers, say, the software engineers, stock options, a comfortable salary, great healthcare, while the warehouse workers or the gig drivers for that same company are struggling to survive.
It completely changes the dynamic.
Does that fracture their solidarity? Do the well-paid software engineers still feel like they have the same class interests as the warehouse workers, or do they start identifying with the success of the company?
That is a perfect modern parallel to the labor aristocracy concept. Marx and Engels observed that this privileged layer of English workers became ideologically dependent on the liberal bourgeoisie.
They didn't want to rock the boat.
Exactly. Their comfort relied on the continued success of British imperial capitalism. They started seeing their interests aligned with their bosses, rather than with the international working class.
And there is a genuinely shocking, visceral example of this in the text. There were two prominent English members of the General Council of the International, these guys named George Odger and Benjamin Lucraft.
Yes, very famous figures at the time.
They were established, respected trade unionists, and when the Paris Commune happened, when French workers were literally being slaughtered in the streets of Paris by the army, Odger and Lucraft refused to show solidarity.
Yep.
They actively distanced themselves from the Commune and eventually resigned from the General Council over it.
It was viewed as a massive, unforgivable betrayal in the eyes of Marx and Engels. I mean, here were leaders of the International sitting on the highest executive body, actively disavowing the very proletarian revolution they were theoretically supposed to be championing.
Because they were getting too close to the bourgeoisie. They didn't want to upset their respectable, liberal political allies in London, the politicians who were finally inviting them into the gentlemen's clubs, by associating with the dangerous, radical, barricade-building workers in Paris.
It's the ultimate triumph of respectability politics over revolutionary solidarity.
It really is.
And what's fascinating here is how Marx and Engels processed this disappointment, because it forced them to refine their theory yet again. They realized that pure economic development under capitalism doesn't automatically create revolutionary consciousness.
It's not inevitable.
No. If the bourgeoisie is wealthy enough and strategic enough, they can create layers within the working class, dividing it and effectively pacifying the leadership.
It's the ultimate divide and conquer strategy, and it's funded by global empire. And it just adds to their seemingly endless list of headaches in Volume 23.
So many headaches.
They're fighting anarchists who weren't organized in Spain, they're fighting reformists who are bought off in England, and they're fighting Lassalleans who want to negotiate with the Kaiser in Germany.
Right.
But amidst all of this high-stakes political warfare, the texts in Volume 23 show they are still grinding away at broader, deeply researched economic writings. They aren't just writing angry letters to each other.
That's a really crucial point. They are simultaneously trying to lay down concrete policies on specific, everyday issues to show how their theory applies to daily life.
Give us an example.
For example, Volume 23 includes Engels' series of articles called The Housing Question.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he analyzes how capitalism inherently creates housing shortages in urban centers, and he critiques the petty bourgeois or middle-class solutions being proposed at the time. He argues that you just can't solve the housing crisis without fundamentally altering the property relations that created in the first place.
That sounds incredibly relevant today.
It really does.
Yeah.
You also have Marx writing The Nationalization of the Land. So they are constantly trying to tie the immediate practical economic pain points back to their larger systemic theoretical framework.
So, synthesizing all of this, what does it actually mean for the movement? We have an organization reeling from the trauma of the Paris Commune, fracturing from within due to ideological civil wars, and facing practical, bloody failures in Spain and insidious co-optation in England.
It's a bleak picture.
It seems like the realization they come to is that just having enthusiasm, just having a mass of angry, exploited workers ready to strike or throw up a barricade is not nearly enough to actually win and hold power.
It was a harsh, undeniable wake-up call for them. Engels realized that the movement needed something much more robust, much more resilient than spontaneous outrage or localized rebellion.
What did it need?
It needed rigorous scientific discipline. And this brings us to a really crucial foundational document in the text. Engels' 1874 supplement to the preface of 1870 for the Peasant War in Germany.
Okay, yes. Our outline notes that Vladimir Lenin, decades later, would call the thoughts in this specific text recommendations to the German working class movement. So this isn't just a casual observation. This is Engels laying out a definitive blueprint for how a party must operate to survive.
Yes. And the most crucial overarching quote from this text is this. Socialism, since it's become a science, demands that it be pursued as a science, that is, that it be studied.
Okay, let's unpack this carefully, because the word science does a lot of heavy lifting here.
It does.
When Engels says socialism is a science, he doesn't mean chemistry or physics, right?
Yeah.
He means a systematized body of knowledge based on the objective analysis of history and economics, what they called historical materialism.
Exactly.
And he says the working class struggle must be pursued in three inseparably linked directions. What are they?
According to Engels, the three directions of struggle are, number one, the theoretical, number two, the political, and number three, the economico-practical.
All right, I have to jump in here and push back on this concept.
I'll say go for it.
Because reading this in the 21st century, it sounds incredibly out of touch.
How so?
Well, we are talking about the 1870s. We are talking about factory workers, coal miners, laborers, many of whom are working 12 or 14-hour days in horrendous, back-breaking, lung-destroying conditions.
But true.
And Engels, sitting at his comfortable desk in London, is demanding that they treat socialism as an academic science, that they need to study it.
I see what you mean.
Isn't that incredibly disconnected from the exhausted, brutal reality of the people he's supposedly talking about? How on earth did they expect a mass movement of illiterate or semi-literate laborers to also act as a rigorous, university-level study group?
It's a very sharp, very fair critique, and it's one that gets at the absolute heart of their organizational challenge. But if we look closely at how they operated in the text, specifically in their letters, The way Marx and Engels viewed it was that this was exactly the reason they spent so much time communicating with party leaders.
So they weren't talking directly to the workers with this.
Right. The frantic letters to Bebel and Liebknecht in Germany weren't just friendly catch-ups. They were intensive, demanding tutorials.
So they weren't expecting every single coal miner in the Ruhr Valley to go home after a 14-hour shift and read Hegel's dialectics.
No, they were not that naive. They expected the party apparatus and the trade union leadership to be the vehicles for this education. The leadership had a duty to absorb this science, to deeply understand the mechanics of capitalism, and then distill it. Their job was to translate the dense theory into accessible strategy, pamphlets, and speeches, and then educate the rank and file.
It was a translation layer.
Exactly. According to Engels, the warrant of success lay entirely in the unity of those three forms of struggle.
The theoretical, the political, and the economic. Let's actually break down why all three are necessary, because if you remove one, the text suggests the whole thing collapses.
Exactly. Let's look at the historical examples we just discussed, right?
Yep.
If you only fight on the economico-practical front, if you just focus on asking for higher wages and better hours without any broader political goal, what happens?
You become like the English reformists. You
Right.
get bought off by the labor aristocracy and become complacent. You win a 10% raise, but you are still fundamentally trapped in a system that dictates your life.
Exactly. Now, what if you only focus on the political?
Well, if you only fight on the political front, trying to maneuver within the state without a solid theoretical grounding, you become opportunists like the Lassalleans.
Precisely.
You end up compromising with Bismarck because you don't understand that the state is structurally designed to defeat you.
Right. And what if you only focus on the theoretical?
And you are just an armchair philosopher. You are writing brilliant critiques of capitalism that nobody reads, and you have absolutely no connection to the actual masses who have the power to change things.
Exactly. Without theory grounding the movement, the political and economic actions would just be blind flailing.
It's like a person trapped in a dark room swinging a baseball bat wildly.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, like you might hit something, you might even do some damage, but you have no idea where the structural supports are. You're probably just going to tire yourself out or hit a concrete wall and break your own wrists.
That's a great way to visualize it. Theory was the flashlight. It allowed them to see the structure of the room, to understand why the housing shortage existed, why the labor aristocracy in England was bought off, and why the anarchists' decentralized military strategy failed so catastrophically in Spain.
So this realization that deep scientific study and highly specific, localized tactical application were absolutely required for survival. This leads Marx and Engels to a really radical, almost shocking conclusion about their own life's work, the First International.
Is one of the most fascinating organizational pivots in political history.
What do they decide?
They realized that a centralized global committee operating out of a room in London couldn't possibly manage the specific, nuanced, scientific application of socialism required in a German parliament versus a Spanish cantonal revolt versus an English trade union strike.
It's too broad.
The conditions were simply too different. The need for agility was way too high.
Which brings us to the winding up of the First International. They don't just let it fade away, they actively pull the plug.
They do.
Let's look at Engels' letter to Friedrich from September 1874. It's a striking, definitive quote. He writes, "The old international is entirely wound up and at an end." Just like that. Done.
And notice the tone in the text,
Yeah.
He doesn't mourn it unnecessarily. He explains the reasoning very clinically, like a scientist discarding a tool that just no longer works.
What's his reasoning?
He writes that the International belonged to a period when, quote, common cosmopolitan interests of the proletariat could come to the fore. It had served its purpose. It had introduced the idea of international solidarity and really dominated European political history for 10 years. But, he concludes, in its old form, it has outlived itself.
You know, it is so rare to see founders do this.
It really is.
It's like realizing the tech startup you founded has completely outgrown its initial garage phase structure. You built it from scratch, you love it, but keeping that centralized, informal structure is now actively harming the company's ability to scale and adapt. You just have to be willing to kill your darlings.
Precisely. The sources from 1874 show a deliberate, strategic pivot to promoting independent, self-sustaining working-class parties in individual countries.
Decentralizing.
Right. They realized that a political party can, as the text explicitly says, only look for its laws to its living and ever-changing needs.
Living in ever-changing needs, that requires intense on-the-ground agility. You can't wait for a slow dispatch from the General Council in London to tell you how to handle a sudden police crackdown in Berlin or a spontaneous rent strike in
No,
Paris.
you'd be crushed before the letter arrived.
Exactly. The local leaders need the theoretical science in their heads so they can make the right tactical calls in the moment.
Exactly. The movement had to mature. And this highlights a profound realization by Engels regarding old rules, dogma, and bureaucracy. He writes this stark warning about any organization, he says. If it seeks to subordinate those needs to earlier resolutions that are now dead as a doornail, it will be digging its own grave.
Dead as a doornail. That is such a vivid, uncompromising phrase.
It really is.
If you cling to the old way of doing things, if you insist on keeping the International alive just because it's how you've always done it, or out of pure nostalgia, you aren't preserving the movement. You are actively digging its grave.
The movement had to decentralize its operations to survive, even as it tightened its theoretical discipline. The specific conditions of post-1871 Europe, the wildly different levels of industrialization across borders, the completely different types of state repression, meant that a one-size-fits-all global edict was now just a massive liability.
It is a burden.
Right. So the death of the International wasn't a defeat, even though it must have felt like one to many people at the time. It was a metamorphosis. It was intentionally clearing the ground so that national parties, armed with the science of socialism, could adapt, camouflage themselves if necessary, and fight on their own specific terrain.
It's truly amazing when you step back and look at the arc of these 3 short years. To summarize the intense journey we've just taken through Volume 23, we watched Marx and Engels navigate the devastating, bloody aftermath of the Paris Commune, pulling crucial lessons about state power from the ashes.
Yeah.
We saw them battling on multiple, exhausting fronts, arguing against anarchists like Bakunin, who wanted to tear down all authority at the expense of military defense, and against reformists and the labor aristocracy, who wanted to cozy up to the bourgeoisie for a slightly bigger slice of the pie.
There's constant conflict.
Constant. We saw them codify their movement as a rigorous science that demanded a 3-pronged discipline: theoretical, political, and economic. And ultimately, we saw them have the sheer audacity and strategic clarity to completely dismantle their own global organization, the First International, because they recognized it had simply outlived its usefulness.
It is honestly a masterclass in ruthless adaptation.
Yeah.
They didn't let ego, nostalgia, or dogma tie them to a failing structure. They prioritized the ultimate goal over the survival of the vehicle they built to get there.
And connecting that back to you, listening to this deep dive right now, it's so fascinating that these massive, earth-shaking historical shifts from the 1870s map so perfectly onto modern organizational theory.
Oh, absolutely.
Identifying when a centralized structure becomes a bottleneck instead of a benefit. Recognizing when you have rogue actors fracturing your open source project or your community. Realizing when your team has been bought off by the comfort of the status quo. And most importantly, having the courage to tear down your own creation to let localized, adaptable versions thrive in a changing environment.
The underlying mechanics of how human beings organize themselves, how power is contested, and how movements survive stress. Whether it's for a 19th century revolution, a 20th century civil rights movement, or a 21st century enterprise, they remain remarkably, sometimes frighteningly consistent.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought based on Engels' warning. Think about the organizations you belong to, the institutions you work for, or even the personal philosophies and habits you adhere to today. Look at them closely. Are they actually adapting to your living and ever-changing needs? Or are they clinging to old resolutions, old structures that are dead as a doornail, and in doing so, quietly, inevitably digging their own graves?
It's a difficult question, but it's one worth asking of any system we build or participate in.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Until next time.